Hello and welcome to today's CUGC User Share. My name is Stephanie Boozer and I am with CUGC HQ. And I'm happy to welcome back to our webinar stage Thorsten Rood. He is a CTP and has over 20 years in IT. He's a frequent speaker all over the place. You've seen his name, I'm sure. And he's currently the CTO at BrainCon. And you can follow him on Twitter at Thorsten Rood, or and then you can also follow us, at myCUGC on Twitter. Before I hand things over to Thorsten to get us started with our namespace dilemma today, just want to cover a couple of housekeeping details for you. We are going to be taking questions throughout the presentation as long as you type them in the question box, but Thorsten's going to save all those for the end of his presentation to answer live, so do type your questions in as we go along and he will keep an eye on those and get to those at the end of the presentation. Additionally, we are going to be recording the presentation and you will receive a link via email tomorrow to watch the recording in case you miss anything. And with that, I am going to hand things over to Thorsten to get us started.
Okay, welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, whatever is the preferred one for you, depending on where you live right now. For me, it's actually evening time, and if you do the recording later on, it's whatever you choose. Thanks for joining us for this session. I brought something for you guys that on the first look doesn't feel like a traditional Citrix, EUC, whatever theme, but I think you will find out later on why that perfectly fits into the overall discussion. So what I've brought to you, just as kind of a flavor, it's something that we will cover today, not meant to be chapters, but this is the 4 pillars that I would like to bring to you in detail. It's about identity and access management. It is about the core thing why I invited you to come here, that ID unification thing that comes up when you go forward to cloud. And that has a side effect on the way where I think and how I think your users should log into your systems future-wise. And for the technical details and for the geeky portion of that, I decided to speak about what Kerberos is about in case of going forward away from a traditional login scheme to the modern login scheme that is in the majority of use cases caused because of Office 365. And so that's the thing. What I obviously will try to do is relate that to our daily work in a Citrix-driven world. So this is the kind of minimum that I'm living in daily. So I have the user audience that interacts with my workloads in typical design as you all have. So they are interacting with the traditional Active Directory. They will be remoting into that environment across any edge environment. Obviously, as you know, I'm the NetScaler guy. I brought my NetScaler example with me. And of course, they interact with 365 and Azure AD. And the interesting thing, if you go the arrow to the bottom line in terms speaking of Active Directory, we talk about workloads, and everybody that deals with EUC workloads in a XenApp and Zendesk world, obviously in the majority of use cases has to deal with applications in detail. And dealing with applications in detail means that we talk about personalized access to whatever backend system. And whenever we want to authenticate to whatever backend system, a lot of things come into play that deal with this identity thing. And in regards to identity, this is kind of the minimum that I would like to run through, giving you kind of examples what that all means. Identity has a lot of flavors, and identity and access management is actually a great topic of mine, which I'm doing like daily right now. It has so many sub aspects and so many dependencies that I could actually spend hours talking about that. We don't have the time today. I'm trying to get you out in less than an hour. So I have the authentication with me. I have the authorization, which actually is a different thing. So you need to differentiate authentication in between authorization. And of course, interoperability with certain other systems outside of a safe harbor environment is interesting and also important to know what the dependencies are. And with that, I would like to keep that as close to the working reality, which everybody I think will realize how much it affects him daily-wise. And unfortunately, we have to do something boring from the ground up. I'm saying actually boring because I would say the majority of you would not expect to be treated about Active Directory today, and that's not my intention. But what I actually need to do is set kind of a baseline so that everybody has a common understanding on what that whole mission is about today. So when we talk about Active Directory fundamentals, I don't want to cover any third-party things. I just want to recap on what the traditional UI is about. So traditional UI means we're talking about these little guys here. They come out. It's the classic user administration in AD. I guess some of you are in charge of doing that themselves. Others of you are relying on other departments and other IT technicians in an organization to actually do this stuff for you and just deliver the accounts. Both things are important because what I've brought to screen that is important for the ongoing details and discussion. The left-hand side shows you what I would call a lazy account, and the right-hand side obviously is something that is a complex setup for an account. If you ever have done that yourself through the UI, you know that some of these fields get pre-populated while you type, so it makes a difference how you interact with the DSA MSC, or if you, for example, use PowerShell scripting, where you provide the name scheme yourselves. But what is important in the end is the difference between certain fields. So if you compare left-hand and right-hand side, you need to have a look at certain attributes that are part of the user object. So we have the user principal name, we have the traditional SAM account name, which comes back and dates back to the NT35 days, and we obviously have the mail attribute. And in a, I would say, real-world environment, they are not necessarily the same for many obvious reasons. If you have a detailed look, specifically comparing left-hand to right-hand side, you see that the prefix one on the left-hand side is identical, whereas the right-hand side has a different naming scheme approach. The right-hand side is something that is at least pretty much common for the industry and the culture where I work in. As you know, I'm coming from the European space, and the idea of targeting user management to a certain ID scheme, which is not part on initials, but more like a numbering scheme, like an employee identifier or whatever that comes from an HR system, is pretty much common with us. So the SAM account name is not necessarily something that reads nicely for the user, but the user base has adopted to that for a long time now. So they feel kind of fine about that, logging into their Windows environment with a user account name that actually doesn't describe them perfectly from a typing perspective. But the UPN name on the top right display is obviously something that you can read more easily, and that's actually the thing that is important to differentiate the user principal name perspective versus the SAM account name perspective, and that becomes important for the ongoing discussion. What I would highly recommend, because I'm running through that, I would say same as you, kind of daily or weekly wise, if you ask for test credentials in any organization, the interesting thing is that for whatever reason, test credentials differ from production accounts. I have no perfect explanation about why that is, but a lot of customers that I'm working with have a different procedure for providing test accounts other than providing real-world user accounts. And what you always should take care about and make sure when they provide you with those credentials for your testing stages, that you get the complex account type, please. If they provide you with that lazy typed guy, like the left-hand side, some of your tests, especially when it comes to interoperability tests, will just work because the identical prefix on the UPN versus the SAM account name, whereas the right-hand side actually is a difference, as you obviously see on screen. And so I would recommend whenever it comes to testing environments and testing sign-offs with the customer, please make sure your test accounts come from the complex world and not from the easy guy. That's just important to know. What's also obvious in the majority of organizations, the Active Directory domain name that was used for setting up all the stuff, either as a fresh install or converted from whatever was there previously and then migrated over and over, into a server 16 directory or server 19 directory, the suffix for the UPN is kind of these .local, .intranet, or whatever domain suffix TLDs, whereas the email space is not the same. I know personally about 3 customers where by chance actually the Active Directory has the same name as the email space, which has advantages, but also obviously has disadvantages in terms of the DNS split thing that comes along with that. But even if you have these lucky customers where the things are identical in phase 1, I highly can guarantee on the next acquisition and merger, the email address space will change anyway. So that is just something that comes close to benefit and then will go away over time. But the reality is the UPN is not the same as the email space, and that's important because next page is something that you also will know. The default legacy name on your domain versus the FQDN for the domain is also something that does not necessarily be the same. And you also have the ability to add the UPN suffix at free choice. So there's nothing rocket science to that. You can add literally any email domain space that you require to make that look nicely. So if you are happy to have hotmail.com as part of your UPN, free to do so. It has side effects in terms of frustrating a certain user base, but technically that's doable. Reality is you will have your primary email space in there as well. So you have different ways of making sure that whatever your Active Directory is about comes closer to the reality from the email perspective. And that email perspective, and by the way, just to say, if you have multi-tenancy setups, multi-tenant environments with a lot of Active Directories that have been, where the merge has not been completed over a long time and they still all exist in a larger forest, and you then have to introduce UPN suffixes, I'm not saying good luck with that, but it is an interesting phase where that you have to go through then, just to say. So if you are free to decide, finish all your merges first and then decide about the UPN thing, and not vice versa, but just as another thing. So why all these things? Why these unification thing? That's the primary driver for that session. ID unification means I would like to create a world for the users where everything works just easier from an end user's perspective. Not necessarily easy for the admin on first look, but the user should be more happy. And that means if you look into today's cloudified world, everybody talks about the email address as the primary identifier for logging into any system. So using Citrix files as the standard example that many customers that many Citrix customers have access to. By the way, Citrix files, that's the AKA guy Sherpa, right? So it's a new naming scheme. The email address is just the thing that is used for logging in. So it's a natural thing to have that as a login credential. So at that point, users start realizing that there might be something different to log into a system than the traditional login scheme that they have been using like for years. The other guy obviously is the 365 guys that have the similar login mask with them. And what they also do is they label this being the email address. And that's what the UI is about. What they technically mean obviously is different. That's just for the frustration of the technologists. When Microsoft Azure AD talks about the email scoping, they refer more to the UPN, which obviously is not the same per se. But that's the thing that I would like to discuss further on. You have to make the UPN look like the email address, and with the customization options in Active Directory, that's actually doable. So the key question that comes up is that something that has a side effect? If I have an existing Active Directory premises-wise, which I will have for a certain while, I will not transition my stuff away just to a pure Azure AD world. I will have my legacy stuff with me for a while. I would perfectly sure that it would happen. Is that dangerous to change that just because Microsoft recommends doing that? Because in the end, you need to make sure that your users don't get frustrated because they have to just type in what the UI asks them for. So if they go to Azure AD and it asks them for an email address, and then mapping does not make it into the UPN scheme, they simply cannot log in, and they get additional screens and stuff like that. So that's the thing where ID unification comes from. With that, the next doesn't come up. Here we go. This is a quick summary about my test account that I would like to use further on. I've brought you the screens from my user. I've brought you the screens from the domain, got you the table. So what you have here is the main attributes. You have my traditional login. I'm using the initials value here, so my first name, last name naming scheme. And of course, if you now have these on screen and you want to introduce that to a new user in your environment, the question is, if you see that, how many ways actually does a user have to log into his system right now? You may have some experiences with that. I'm just curious how far that has come. Stephanie has presented or prepared a poll for you, which should come up on screen. I would like to get a quick answer from you guys. How many ways do I personally, with that specific attributes, now have to log into a Windows workstation, either a physical one, a virtualized one, doesn't matter. So what's your answer on that? So Stephanie brings up the poll. Anywhere here to click? I don't know.
Yep, I have it up right now. I have about 50% have voted.
Okay.
I'll give them another couple seconds here. And then I'll show the results. And all right, I'll close the poll.
Okay, we at least have a favorite, so to say, right? Can you fade that in? Can you fade that in?
Yep. Can you see the results, Thorsten?
I can see. Well, how can I fade them in now? Okay, so we have at least a favorite in here. That's good. I would like to continue with the screen. Should be the PowerPoint back on. Okay. So you may be surprised, but that's the intention for that. The answers for here. Of course, you have at least one option here, which comes with the same account name. Obvious one. Second one, which is a technical difference in terms of typing, in terms of analyzing the stuff. I guess a lot of you will now say, hey, okay, that's unfair. But really, from a technical perspective, 1 and 2 is not the same thing, although it looks pretty much close. If you think about multi-tenancy Active Directories, that is a difference because the default domain may not be the one where your user is in. Third one, which was also a voting from all you, is the UPN. Which looks pretty much good. And as we have more space on screen, there is a fourth one. And to be honest, there's a fifth one. That's just my offering to stay with me until the end. I will reveal 4 and 5 later on, because there's really a lot of dependency in here to understand why that is. What I first would like to do is bring a thesis. The user principal name is actually pretty much unused today, and nobody cares about that. Hopefully that will change. There are some exceptions where that might be already in place. Coming to that later. The other thing, if you authenticate to your environment and you have the user ID ready in your system in whatever middleware, it could be an access concentrator like Gateway, it could be whatever middleware system, web server, or whatever application server there is, and you need to authenticate your user to another backend system forward, which is the single sign-on. I would suspect the majority of scenarios that everybody deploys then leverage the same account name style for SSO, which I also say that's not 100% accurate. If you are already deploying threaded authentication services, you know that there are requirements to do that differently. If you are in a multi-tenancy environment, you obviously have to do that different there as well. So that are the exceptions. And the third one, which is my personal mission, don't know if that succeeds today, but maybe over the course of time, I would say the end or the exit path to all the frustration that comes from to both the end users and the administrators into environments that become more complex, that become cloudified over time. The more natural exit path is thinking about just having the UPN all over the place. So front-end wise for the users and back-end wise for any back-end authentication. Hopefully. Well, no, you don't have to, but just keep that as an idea. So if the third step, that the UPN overrules any decision, is an important step, this is obviously a question that comes up. If we now change our end-user computing strategy in terms of authentication and now give our users a welcome letter saying, oh, by the way, next morning, this is your new credential to log in, and by the way, it's your email address. And you just go to any Windows asset in your environment, your physical computer, laptop, thin client, whatever front-end device or workspace that you use for logging in, please use the email address all over the place without any exception. That may be risky, right? Because that could be kind of the quick blueprint how that all looks like. You have a user that interacts with a cloudified world, could be the Microsoft-driven thing, could be Citrix files, could be any other. That's natural where the email address will just fit. There's no magic behind. On the local area access, it is about finding out if it makes a difference working with different credentials, which still represent the same user. And when it comes to remote access to the environment for either HTTP proxy or webified content, it may be important from a configuration perspective if the thing that user has typed into the login form now has to be probed in a different way to actually find the user in the directory. So these are the three ways that could be different and important. So I personally call this a hybrid login because on the first day, obviously not everybody in the organization will change to that. You will do that in phases. So all your systems literally have to support the traditional way, which is, I would still place a bet on that, same account name driven. And the same system at the same time has to support a subset of users which now start using the UPN, or AKA the email address, for logging in, and that's the hybrid login. And that is something that is my personal experience that is just about to start always over the place, regardless where you are, to make your systems more ready for going into a cloudified world. So that doesn't necessarily mean you go with your asset fully cloud, but you change your user behavior and your support processes in a way so that your complete organization becomes more ready for enabling and adopting cloud technologies. And that really starts with authentication. So with that, I would start with front-end authentication, where the user interactivity happens, so supporting SAM account and UPN side by side. Do I have to worry? If I go to my user audience and say them, hey, next day please use the email address, I've changed your extra-directory attributes in the backend so that they are in compliance with the email address scheme. Do I have to worry when that happens? Because so many things may be different from that point. Interesting thing is, even if you log in with the UPN on the next day, the environment variables, the profile paths, and all the stuff that deal with the identity on the Windows tier, so within the authenticated Windows session, they all will show you the same account name. So regardless of what you have typed, all your scriptings and all your configurations, customizations, whatever has happened, even the profile paths, they just remain as they are, which is basically the good news with that. So there is no huge dependency of doing that. On the UI itself, it is a little inconsistent. Sometimes Windows displays the user actually what he has typed, so the UPN in case it was used. However, throughout Windows settings and control panel, it's still a lot of places where that fails back into the same account naming scheme. So the user may be a little bit disoriented with that. I wouldn't say it's the end of the world. It's just something where you have to keep an eye on. Nothing will break at that point. And what that also shows that Microsoft itself seems to be kind of favoring the same account name for all internal procedures. To be honest, that's all Windows 10 Server 16 and upwards. There are some discrepancies if you have the older legacy ones. Not want to spend much detail today with that, so please keep your heads up if you have them in place. Maybe a little different, but the modern versions of the OSs, they just don't care. That's pretty much the takeaway of that. However, don't go just around and now fire the script of renaming all your user attributes for email compliance, because there could be something where that will just have a problem. If you have these 3 different categories in place, which means you have smart cards enrolled, which have a burned-in attribute for the UPN. If you have AO2.1x Wi-Fi or even cabled networks with authentication based on software certificates, that's pretty much the same as the smart card perspective. There's something rolled out as a credential which has an attribute included, which will not just change because it is decoupled from your Active Directory once it has been populated on the device. And the same stuff may apply to smartphones and tablets that have been linked to an MDM solution to the company and used for authentication purposes using those software certificates. If you go there into Active Directory and change the attributes overnight to be in better compliance with the user expectation, it will simply break that users. So you need kind of an exit path to make that better available again. You need to batch that in phases. You need to find ways how to save those users over the course of time so that they don't get locked out completely. What you actually need to do for the majority of use cases, you need to alter the UPN values at scale. And if it is already in use for at least 3 examples above, make sure to test them better. It could be really something that includes a deadlock. So not everybody has greenfield deploy, as I know. If you don't fall into that category, you're likely good to go with any dangers across with that. Another interesting thing, now that you have the idea to promote the UPN to your users, that still means it is likely that some users just ignore the message that there is something new available and they attempt to use the old traditional login. Or you have to create batches of users, like department-wise rollout or geographically differentiated rollouts, so that the same system could be used by different user audiences. And that means that you have to make sure that these nice login masks that ask for a username have to support that in a hybrid way. You need to allow both of them. In the end, it doesn't matter if the user prefers to have the old name there. It's actually okay. You may have to alter the field descriptions, the tooltips, and all the stuff that goes in with those masks. So if you have them customized in different ways, you need to make sure that the hints and the text makes sense to what is configured. And if you have traditional LDAP authentication, this is the traditional Netscale example, which you may recognize. Those cascades will then have 2 different policies side by side. The first one will try to fetch the user based on the same account name attribute. The second one will try to do that based on user principal name. There's a rocket science. It's either the first or the second one that hits, and that then authenticates the user. What you obviously have with that, if you go this route, you try to authenticate, or let's say to authenticate at least half of the users in a wrong way. So the event log will show you kind of unknown user errors because of the mismatch. This is something you have to live with if you use traditional login. That's one of the reasons why I would like you to make familiar with what is called N-factor, which is an interesting and also important functionality that has come to Citrix ADC and Gateway for a while right now. This is something that changes the engine, how the Netscale authentication system handles what has been typed by the user. Just as a very common example, if you have multi-factor authentication and you now start allowing the user to either submitting a SAM account name or an UPN as a hybrid methodology, that doesn't necessarily mean that the MFA system has ever been prepared to support that in the same way. So it might be a requirement that the Radius MFA has to see the SAM account name, for example, regardless of what has been typed by the users. So that requires you to be more creative in the way you fetch those credentials. And what N-factor allows you to do is to probe the user for existence in Active Directory. So you fetch them either by SAM account or UPN and just check out which of these both policies has a success result, which is not an authentication at that point. It's just a query about user existence. And once you have that, you forward the way depending on where the match has been, and you have better control of what you actually use for authentication. This is better described visually. You have obviously something that has a query to the Active Directory. As part of the Active Directory query, you can collect in more attributes from the user object, which could be some account name, UPN, the email address. You collect other attributes anyway in terms of authenticating to Azure AD, for example. And once you have these attributes in place, like the attribute 1, 2, 3, and 4, like here on screen, what you then can do later on when it comes to authentication, you can define which of these user attributes should be used for being sent to the backend. So in that specific example, you can preset that this backend has to be provided with the same account name, even if you have been logging in with a user principal name. So just as an example, and to see that better in detail, this is the way it would look like. In an n-factor cascade, you just try to find the user on both of the ways that your hybrid login supports. You will find them in either of these two cases. If not, it was an unknown user per se, and you just deny the access. But once you have the user, then you can use this attribute mapping scheme to send, for example, the same account name to your Radius's MFA, because those legacy systems may be not accepting a UPN. And then for LDAP authentication, you switch over to the UPN and also use that identity for the single sign-on to the backend, to Storefront, and to other web resources. And that way you're good to go. So if you haven't heard about n-factor yet, I highly recommend spending time with that. Maybe there's also another ID for a webinar. We will see. So that's just the thing, how you can handle hybrid logins in a specialized use case for gateway. There are other VPN concentrator solutions that behave in a similar way. There are also others that simply cannot do that. So you need to make sure when you transition to that, what the specific user access tier is about, and if that actually supports all these things. As I was saying, these probing for the username in that way does not cause you a forensic issue on your domain controllers, because that is not an authentication. That's just a query for user existence. The authentication comes in the bottom line. The upper ones are just queries for existence. So that makes the security guys more happy. Switching to backends, so speeding up a little bit more, that we don't have to keep you longer than needed and longer than invited. SSO, there is also no perfect answer. You can decide on still continuing using the same account name because it is the de facto standard. It is obviously the most tested version. Or you switch that to a way where the backend authentication also is using the UPN now instead, which at least makes it easier if you have a multi-tenancy or multi-domain forest with you. In that cases, the UPN makes a lot of things easier. Of course, thinking about Storefront specifically, everybody knows the ability in Storefront to lock down the available domains so that users cannot choose anything else. And if you have a new naming scheme in here, like the email address, you have to include that in your trusted domains. Even if the user comes from a different directory, technically, the Storefront does that using that matching based on the ASCII comparison. So the third domain name here in the trusted domain box that is in the red circle right now, obviously is not the technical Active Directory domain name, but just the needed mapping to get the email being typed there. But it has to be in there in the allowed list. Otherwise, you get these nice little error message which could look like this. It failed because the SSO was not allowed for logging in. So a lot of things are important with that. So not necessarily just changing the UPN scheme will make you happy. You also need to make sure that some of the back-end systems get a little bit converted into that. There are some nice traps, which depends on the way how you've configured your systems. What you should absolutely not do future-wise is using or continuing using that single sign-on domain attribute there, which unfortunately is populated in a lot of scenarios. That is the anti-domain parameter. There is no way of unsetting that value when it has been configured into some other matching policy, because the policy design NetScale doesn't allow you an unset logic. You just have to get rid of that per se on the global level, and then make sure that on the applied policies, it has not been accidentally applied. Because if you still have that in place, a lot of things will happen. I've brought 2 examples there. So the left-hand portion is the UPN-based login. Right-hand portion is still the traditional SAM account name. If you know that the anti-domain parameter causes a change in that effectively used SSO name, you see why that parameter is not the best one to be used on a hybrid login. So my recommendation would be get it cleared. And in case of clearing that, make sure that you clear that for both gateway and for AAA purposes. So please no longer use that specific guy. You can easily come away without, blank and unconfigured, and then rely on the UPN instead, or do other ways there. But this is really the thing that breaks environments very easily. Interestingly, that's something that you may come in contact with from both the end-user computing space when you deal with applications that have to authenticate to a backend system, which is Unix-driven. Could be just the case. A lot of companies have these hybrid environments anyway, where your Windows environment has access to whatever Unix or Linux-driven backend, where you want to have SSO, which means negotiation comes into place. The same thing could be happening to you if you have NetScaler in between for authentication purposes. And negotiate is an interesting thing. That's the reason why I brought it with me. You may have been with me in other sessions on previous events where I was talking about using NetScaler with negotiate single sign-on perspective, for example, as an identity provider. And that's the example we'd like to discuss. And the same stuff happens to any other Linux backend system in the day when you change your login scheme, regardless what the users are using, because of some fundamental differences. What you need to understand is the difference between the authentication and the authorization phase. So just as an example, the negotiate means the client, so the Windows domain member, successfully negotiates Kerberos with a authentication system running on whatever Linux, could be NetScaler, could be a Linux middleware or whatever. So the negotiate is the easy portion. It will just succeed regardless if the user has been using a SAM account, a UPN, if that name scheme was unified or not, that will just be okay. Requirements are the same as usual. You need all these service principal name things, DNS matches, time drifts, all the stuff that comes with Kerberos. That doesn't change because of unifying the user schemes. What actually changes, that's different, because once you have the identity from the Kerberos handshake, you need to find the user in your directory. Because as you know now no longer have a Windows system, but instead a Linux system, you have to rely on LDAP to fetch the user from somewhere. And that's the special handling thing. I'll give you an example of what happens here. Imagine you have a Windows user, right-hand side above on screen, that wants to have access to an identity provider that authenticates forward to Office 365. Then you have the login using the UPN or the SAM account name. That's okay. You negotiate to Kerberos, so the system now knows that the user is successfully a domain member user credential, and then you go forward for LDAP to actually find the user. And with that, you then log into Office 365 or whatever. That could be any SaaS offering. The problem that comes along with that, this translation from step 1 into step 2, this one backwards from 1 to 2. This is the interesting thing, because the Kerberos works different once the user has a non-standard UPN. There's an unexpected surprise. I would like to give you some details here. When I have that user now switched over to a unified scheme, where you now see the user principal name is the same attribute as the mail address is, so the user is pretty much happy with that. You have 2 different UPNs for that user. I'm not sending you another poll. I'm giving you the result directly. The obvious UPN that user has is the one that you have been entered there as an attribute. That's obviously there. Unfortunately, which is just due to the matter of how Active Directory works, you have the implicit UPN also as part of the user, which is a computed one. which is nothing you can configure yourself, which is just there, and that exists for login purposes, and that's the way how Kerberos actually authenticates your users all over the place. However, if you now read that example on screen and you compare that to my user attributes in the table above or in the screen's left-hand side from the DSA, that specific attribute is nowhere. It exists, you know, technically it has to be there, but if you do an LDAP query to the domain controller, you will not have a way to find the user based on that. It's simply not there, and that makes a difference. So let me showcase what that means. I don't want to bore you with that table. That's for later on. You get the presentation anyway sent around by Stephanie. There are some difference how that all works like. Let me show you what happens here. You go into the negotiate, which succeeds, which is okay, and then you try to find the user through Active Directory. And that means that you need to know that what you get from the Kerberos is not the explicit UPN, but instead the implicit UPN, which is the SAM account name based driven one. So you need to make sure that your LDAP query strips anything beyond the @ and including the @ obviously. So with that, this is the important thing. It will work forward. And if you have an NTLM failback, because there could be some Apple users that are not domain members for sure, another exit path is needed. I don't want to spend time on that today, go through it later, but the important is really this guy here. And I would like to showcase how that feels like. This is a quick rough overview. Red hand background means we are the administrator. I'm showing you my user account, which is now SAM account name and UPN identity. Switching to blue means it is my user now logging into the system. I'm using the non-modified user logging into the system. I have a browser that can do negotiate to a test system, and that shows me this is my UPN. It shows me groups. It shows me anything the system needs to know to incorporate Azure functionality. And now I go back into my Active Directory and change that to an UPN that matches my email space, so a custom UPN. Go back to my system, so logging in with my new UPN right now, which is the same user. Right? I'm doing nothing differently. Same user attributes, same profile. I'm going to the same way. And now this guy has a problem because he says me I did a different username. What I have been logging in was my new UPN, which was my email address. However, on screen, it shows me something very different. And that means from a NetScaler perspective, you need to take care that the traditional lookup by either UID or UPN no longer works. You need to make sure that you have a third method of finding the user. So that's why I call the trim IUPN functionality. So you take the user ID that you got from the negotiate phase, and you know that it is in a specialized format with a SAM account name at domain name. And so this specific one guy has a login scheme, and that login scheme is just saying, hey, by the way, take this user and just strip anything in front beyond the @ symbol. So the resulting thing is just a SAM account name. If you bind that and say refresh, this guy now has a chance to survive and locate the user directory, a user in the directory again. So you need to make sure that these special workarounds, the difference between the IUPN and the EUPN, is handled by your systems. What you also see is if you look at the Kerberos train on the Windows tier, Kerberos never has been using the traditional UPN in any place. So that's the important takeaway here. Going forward, trying to do a quick one to keep the time on pressure. So we're running short on that anyway. The other perspective, it is about seeing what happens if you come from a non-password scenario and want to go forward to Kerberos. My personal preference comes typically from the mobile space, so smartphones, whatever, things that deal with mobile mail. So active sync with certificate-based authentication is my personal playground that typically comes into play here. Again, the scenario is about identifying a user without requesting a password. So it comes down to software certificates, kind of like smart cards. This is pretty much easy because what you can do is you can look up the UPN, because what is in the software certificate is exactly the UPN attribute from Active Directory. That is the easy portion. At that point, in that direction, that is the easy handling. The other way is now how to create a negotiate credential to actually logging in this user into Exchange. So the requirements are the same as in other Kerberos scenarios as well. So delegations, time drifts, firewall names, object names, all the stuff that remains as is. So you have the smartphone enrolled with a software certificate. Could be the native client, could be Citrix Secure Mail, so any mail client that supports certificate-based authentication. It has my UPN with the email address, and obviously you can authenticate to a Netscaler ADC using certificate-based authentication. And at that point, this guy then fetches the user from Active Directory, which is pretty much standard. You can find that because of the attribute. And then the negotiate phase to Exchange has to come in, because the user did not provide you a password, but you still want to have access to the mailbox. And this is where another translation has to come into play. So from UPN into negotiate. And this is also a thing because the engine on Linux systems was designed to deal with the I UPNs and not the E UPNs. So what you need to basically do is to make sure that the system learns that. So if you by default do nothing, your Kerberos will fail because the logic, how the tickets are requested from your domain controllers, result in either server names or usernames that simply do not exist. But as you know, that there is a difference in the way Kerberos works. Like, you need to translate the explicit UPN that you have read out from the certificate into the implicit UPN, which means you take the same account name from your LDAP, you just append the traditional LDAP name in behind, and with that, it's pretty much worry-free. You have a device registered to an MDM solution with no email configured so far. You go there and see there's nothing deployed except for the basic configuration. You switch that guy over from the admin perspective and configure an active sync profile that has a software certificate for authentication purposes. So you know the email space, you have the policies, then you go there and create a credential provider that pushes down a software certificate to that device coming from your internal certificate infrastructure, and it writes the user principal name into the certificate and associates that certificate with an active sync profile, which you also push out to the device. So that is part of the policies that get applied and configured to the device. I didn't show that here. So you pick that certificate for authentication purposes. Then you go there and associate that policy with all your users and deploy that. Here we go. Next. I'm bad on timing today. We're running behind a few minutes, but I'm almost through. Deploy that to the device. So it silently deploys one more certificate. It also deploys an Exchange account. And that account is completely worry-free functional without providing any passwords, because the Kerberos translation is done by the Netscaler in between, even if you're using non-standard domain names there. And what you see here is that you have a pre-configured account name that has no ability to actually provide a password here. So all that is part of the software stack. So with that, we are going to the recap phase. We were calling that in the early phase of the webinar, how many login schemes for the user. A lot of votings were for 3 options. Hopefully you had at least these 3 guys available. I've been saying I have a 4th and a 5th one. With everything discussed about Kerberos, you now notice that there is a 4th candidate, which is the implicit UPN coming from the Kerberos thing. And what is also interesting at that point, that there is also a 5th candidate, which is also available, and that is this guy here, which is the reverse order. It's also possible. If you want to try that out later on with your environment, feel free. I'm happy to hear your results. You actually, for a single user with a complex setup, you have at least these 5 options. I'm not aware of a 6th one. I'm also curious to see if somebody comes up with a 6th, but these 5 ones are available. From a testing perspective, you should have all these 5 versions being tested, because creative users could actually use them and Windows will let them in. Eventually, some dependencies come up that you wouldn't have expected there. But anyway, what I still would say on native Windows, it actually doesn't matter if you use the same account name or the UPN. It falls back to the same account name plus whatever Kerberos requires, which is the implicit UPN. So if somebody is telling you that the same account name is kind of a legacy thing coming from the NT3 or NT4 days, that's actually not true. Even in the modern Windows 10 world, the same account name is pretty much popular. However, the UPN as a typed credential will become the new de facto standard over course of time because of the user requirement. On non-Windows devices, it's actually doable to handle them with UPNs, either exclusively or hybrid. However, it is required to put kind of intelligence into those systems to get the mapping correctly done. Otherwise, you will end up in users that are just partially authenticated and have no resources and other things that then will occur. In the backend world, obviously a lot of backend systems expect a same account name there and get a little bit crazy if you then confront them with a UPN without actually negotiating that change with the respective administrators. But I still would say it is worth pursuing a strategy where the UPN is used both front end and back end wise. As usual, a lot of configs shown. You can grab them from the traditional GitHub repository just to get an impression how policies will look like. That's pretty much the takeaway from the configs, that you can verify them with the screens. I'm running out of time. I'm overrunning the time actually. Let me quickly see about the questions window, which is here. How many have been arriving? So you're free to post something there. For the sake of time, I would just collect them and get the summary to you by email. That's okay. Just to keep the recording a bit better in time. With that, I'm inviting you to other webinars. I'll be doing another one by end of August, which is the premise-based one. So just a subset of you guys will obviously have a chance to attend there. But in case you're around, VCRMN in Darmstadt will happen. So I'm happy to invite you there. And with that, I would say thank you for attending here. Hopefully it was interesting for you guys. And with that, thank you, and over to Stephanie.
All right, thank you so much. That was a lot of information, and I'm sure that the questions will get in there. I think that I know you had one question that I think you actually answered during the presentation, so that's always neat when that happens. Thank you all for attending today. I've put one link in the chat window for you. It's a short survey. We like to get your feedback. It doesn't take very long and it's anonymous. So if you could fill that out for us, that would be great. And otherwise, I just invite you to come over to mycugc.org and find your local group. We have over 70 around the world and they have local meetings all the time. So definitely find your local group and get plugged in. And also on our site, we have forums. You can ask questions. We have lots of blog posts. There's tons of information and resources out there for you, as well as more webinars. So I will return you all to your day. Thank you again, Thorsten. It's always a pleasure to have you do webinars with us. So I'm glad to have you back and hope to see you again in the future.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a great day.